The Ryzen hype train reached velocities capable of entering low Earth orbit as we ramped into today's launch. We had 4 days with all hands on deck to benchmark the AMD Ryzen R7 1800X that we're reviewing today, socketed in ASUS's high-end X370 Crosshair motherboard. Our Ryzen R7 1700 review will post tomorrow, with the 1700X review posting the day after that. Today we're looking at the 1800X in Blender, Premiere, thermals, and gaming workloads. And before getting to Ryzen, this coverage is brought to you by Thermaltake's new Contact Silent 12 CPU cooler. The Contact Silent 12 fully supports the AM4 socket type and aims to be available around the $30 mark. Thermaltake's Contact 12 uses a hydraulic bearing for longer and quieter operation and would do well on an R7 1700. Learn more at the link in the description below. Speaking of links in the description, this review is massive. It's a new architecture, so check the link in the description below for the full review. It's nearing 10,000 words, has a bit more depth than we have here because of time constraints, so check the article for the full Ryzen architecture and benchmarks, but we can go into most of it here. The core specs are on the screen now. The R5 1600X and 1500X, interestingly, will offer sub $300 parts with 6 cores and 12 threads in quarter 2, with R3 parts due in the second half. Today we're looking only at the R7 1800X. For some brief details, major changes to the Ryzen architecture center around the CCX and its replacement of Bulldozer modules. Ryzen CCX moves to implementing a single FPU per core rather than 1 per 2 integer units on Bulldozer, and it also uses a single SIMD and private L2 cache per core. AMD has moved to wider instruction level parallelism, but still uses narrower floating point units, and AMD is running 512K of L2 cache per core at 1.5 millimeters squared per core. This 512K cache is 8-way associative, so AMD doesn't need probes to interfere with low latency caches during snoops. The SRAM is less dense than Intel's, but is still 6T SRAM for tag and data, with 8T for state. L3 cache totals 8 megabytes at 16 millimeters squared of the total die area, which by the way is 44 millimeters squared. L3 is also 16-way associative and shares PLL with all cores. The L3 cache can be shut down if only L1 and L2 are in use, which helps with automated power savings. Each CCX is a 4-core, 8-thread module, meaning that we won't be seeing dual-core CPUs out of the currently known Zen architecture. AMD's L1 and L2 bandwidth are up about 2 times over previous architectures, with L3 up about 5-fold. The victim cache is shared across the CCX and operates at the frequency of the fastest core, which means that it also reduces frequency alongside the fastest core to further provide power savings. For each integer unit, there are 4 ALUs and 2 AGUs, or address generation units, with a 2K op cache present, and AMD's got a new micro op cache that is also something we'll be talking about in the article. AMD's queue has gotten significantly larger versus Bulldozer, though the company does still have major architectural differences from Intel. One example would be AMD's AVX units. The company is running 2 128-bit wide units instead of the 256-bit wide units in Skylake, and is using 2 256-bit load ports. This design takes less space overall, contributing to AMD's smaller area per core than comparable Intel chips, but does mean that we should expect different vector performance. AMD is also running 1 fewer AGU than its direct competition, which should help the company clock higher and will also lower power consumption. This is potentially at the cost of performance and workloads that can saturate 3 AGUs with 2 loads and a store per clock, but AMD thinks that it's worth the trade-off. As for an answer to Intel's fiber, AMD has one. They're sticking with linear voltage regulators to reduce complexity, heat, and retain conversion efficiency, and given how Intel's fiber was received, that might be a good choice. If you're curious about the AM4 chipset differences, we already have that content on the channel. Search for AM4 chipset differences or hit the link in the description below to the full review. Let's talk about memory for now. In the leaks leading up to Ryzen's launch, there were plenty of posts by users and other sites that talked about potential memory limitations on Ryzen. This was true to some extent, though maybe not as exaggerated as some folks may have made it. The official memory support for Ryzen right now is 2667 megahertz. That's what was largely suggested for benchmarking. We were able to clock up to 2933 megahertz on the kit provided and used that for our tests, and we're not able to sustain higher clock rates than 2933 for a few reasons. One of them, we have a Hynix Die Corsair kit. It officially is rated for 3000 megahertz, but to get any kind of higher frequency, you would need to do a few things. One, custom reference clock and VDIM tuning, and 2, ideally step through memory training, and then 3, Note that there is a distinct lack of memory subtimings in Ryzen, and that's more of an AMD thing than a motherboard thing. So that would be less on Asus and more on AMD. This makes it a little difficult to get the higher clock rates that some of the kits might sell at. And at the time we were working on this review, which is of course prior to launch, the only officially validated kit of memory is the Corsair 3000 MHz Vengeance LPX kit that we had access to, which again we clocked to 2933 MHz. Enough of the theory though, time to get to the benchmarks. As always, the full testing methodology and all of the platforms used, it's defined in the article in the description below. We have to obviously change motherboard, memory, depending on architecture, stuff like that. It's all defined down there. And we're going to start with the Ryzen thermals versus clock over time, and then we'll be moving on to Adobe Premiere, Blender, and gaming workloads. This first chart shows two things primarily. We're looking at CPU junction temperature in blue and average frequency of the cores in red. Ideally, the red line is perfectly flat when under heavy load, indicating a more stable core clock. The blue line should never exceed 75C, as that is technically AMD's maximum junction temperature for the 1800X or TJ Max. We were able to intentionally trip a thermal shutdown by heating the CPU beyond 75C and validated that yes, TJ Max is in fact between 75 and 80 Celsius. Gauging thermal performance on AMD isn't exactly easy, and the diode reporting has some inconsistencies at times that manifest in the form of massive reported temperature drops. In reality, we're able to use thermal probes mounted to the package to gain some additional insight as to the accuracy of the measurements, and then we can make appropriate adjustments to our testing methodology. If we zoom into the chart, you'll see that the clock rate becomes less stable and starts to fluctuate in increments of 25 to 75 megahertz once temperature approaches 73 to 75 Celsius. This is AMD's internal sensors working with the clock to keep temperatures under control, downclocking in rapid intervals, and then upclocking again to keep thermals below 75C. And by the way, this is with an NZXT Kraken X62 at max fan speeds, so it's running pretty hot. This is an 1800X. Anyone putting this chip under 100% workloads for long uptimes like Blender rendering and things like that should seriously consider better cooling than the Noctua unit that AMD provided most reviewers. And that's why we switched, thanks to the AM3 support on the Crosshair, to an X62. Now, we also logged voltages versus applications, power draw, things like that for comparative power draw charts. Link in the description below, but we can go over the basics now. With 185 watts total system power consumption, again, that's total system power consumption, we see the Ryzen R7 1800X operating at a steady boost frequency of 3.7 gigahertz when all cores are engaged. This number only ever increases to XFR range of 4.1 if a single thread workload is underway, which is pretty uncommon for most of our audience, but we do have some tests to show it. The voltage to sustain Blender at this clock rate and 100% load ranges from 1.221 vCore to 1.243. Cinebench 1T pushes us up to 4.1 gigahertz at times, but fluctuates between 3.7 and 4.1. This workload generates a voltage of about 1.395 to 1.461 vCore with total system power consumption at 92 watts. Finally, POV Ray 1T runs a 94 watt system power draw with 4.1 gigahertz fixed for the frequency, fully in XFR range for the entire bench, and a core voltage of about 1.417 volts. Let's open up with Ryzen strong points. Our video production workload is a real-world test pulling from files and export settings from our EVGA ICX review. So this is a real render for our YouTube channel. Color correction, transforms, and other calculations like warp stabilization may be included in the render. Check the article below for specific render settings. Configured to its stock clocks, the R7 1800X completes the task in 67.4 minutes, with the 6900K completing the video render in 68.5 minutes. If you prefer percentages, that's a change of 1 to 2%. In rendering terms, you'd be saving about 1 minute for every hour of encoding. Ignoring all context, that's not impressive, but context is what matters. The context here is that the 1800X is a $500 CPU with high-end motherboard support, like the Crosshair, available for $255. Intel's i7-6900K is $1,000, and high-end motherboards cost $300 plus. Quad-channel memory, of course, is lost with Ryzen, but it's also not the most beneficial item in this type of test. That said, anyone running production renders knows it's the GPU that counts for most rendering tasks, despite some specific use cases where a high-end CPU can be beneficial. For Premiere, we'd never use the CPU as a primary render workhorse. Cuda and Opencl acceleration where supported are significantly faster, and this is where AMD's argument starts to fall apart. This chart puts our render numbers into perspective, relying instead on the GTX 1080 FTW and Cuda for the rendering process. The result is expected. Our render times drop from 60 minutes to 20 minutes or thereabouts. Rendering on the CPU takes 3 times as long, and using a Ryzen CPU and GPU is not any faster or really much slower than using a 6900K and the same GPU to render. AMD deserves praise for accomplishing comparable render speeds to Intel's double-costed CPU, the 6900K, but we also have to frame that praise within reality. And the reality is that for this type of workload, you're probably using Cuda anyway, so the argument is a bit weaker when considering that option. Moving on to Blender, GN uses a custom-built Blender benchmark for its CPU rendering performance analysis. The benchmark mixes fur rendering, motion blur, multi-bounce ray tracing, and various transparencies and mattes. The AMD Ryzen R7 1800X completes the frame render in just under 28.73 minutes, with the i7 6900K completing the render in 29.05 minutes. This puts AMD's $500 1800X about on par with the $1,000 6900K in the Blender rendered task, at least when both are in stock configuration. The R7 1800X is therefore about 1 to 1.1% faster. Normally this would be unsurprising or uninteresting, but the price makes AMD's R7 platform a worthy consideration. Overclocked, we see the 6900K at 4.4 GHz reduce its render time to 25.35 minutes, while the Ryzen chip overclocked is at 27.8 minutes, so Intel now pulls ahead. AMD falls behind when overclocking, but it's still half the price. Intel also overclocks significantly higher in memory if you were to actually try, which we didn't do too much with that. And that's potentially useful in some specific tasks. As for other devices, the $340 7700K stock hyperthreading on completes the same render in 42.4 minutes, with the overclocked variant finishing in 38 minutes. We're curious to see how the Ryzen R7 1700 holds up to the 7700K in this task. For reference, the 8370 completes in 90.22 minutes, so either way, AMD is doing a lot better than previously. Ryzen holds a lead here, even if it does come down to a difference of about 1.1%. But now it's time to move on to gaming workloads. So if you want to see the rest of the synthetics and other tests, that includes Firestrike, Cinebench, and TimeSpy and POV Ray benchmarks, you can find all of that in the link in the description below and the full review article. Moving on to Battlefield 1, the 6900K and 7700K overclocked with some loss and lows are bumping against a wall around 141 to 142 FPS average. We're still seeing the high IPC and clock rates of the 7700K planting the chip about equal to an i7 6900K. This remains true for the 6700K, the i5 7600K, and the i7 4790K. The i5 6600K begins to drag behind a bit at 137 FPS average, and that CPU is eventually trailed by the R7 1800X, overclocked to 3.9 GHz, which lands somewhere around 135 FPS average. The 1% lows hover around 109 with 0.1% at 94 for the overclocked version of the CPU, and considering the low percentile performance of neighboring chips, that's good performance overall. However, considering the price and age of those nearby chips, the 1800X doesn't look so great in this particular benchmark. Ultimately, the $500 R7 1800X is effectively equivalent to an i5 4690K in this Battlefield 1 benchmark. The i5 4690K came out a few years ago and once retailed for $240. Trade-offs abound as usual, with the R7 being better in production, but one thing is clear, the 1800X is not impressive in the Battlefield 1 department and is matched evenly by 2014 Intel architectures. You may have noticed a black bar across the data. Let's remove that now. Disabling SMT, or simultaneous multi-threading, on the R7 1800X results in performance that boosts us to 135 FPS average from the 132 FPS average of the stock clocked R7 1800X. Because Gamers Nexus also measures frame times, we benefit from the knowledge that disabling SMT further increases 1% low and 0.1% low metrics by upwards of 30 FPS in some cases, around 30% better 1% low values with SMT off. You'd be better off disabling SMT than overclocking in some cases, though if you do both, you'll get even more of a performance jump. And by the way, AMD is not alone in that. Previously, in much older architectures when we tested years ago, Intel's hyperthreading did add a bit of overhead to the point where in some games and applications, disabling hyperthreading might have gotten you 1 to 2% FPS increase. It's not as big of a difference as AMD is seeing here with this SMT toggling, but also AMD is not alone. The overhead from multi-threading, simultaneous or hyperthreading, however you want to call it, is real, and it's something we've seen in the past. It just so happens that Intel doesn't really see that effect anymore. Total War was only just added to our charts in time for the 7600K review, so all the i7 CPUs haven't been fully subsumed by the Warhammer bench just yet. Warhammer also gets finicky about the stability of some overclocks, so as you'll see in the frame time metrics for the 6900K, they can jump up and down a bit to the point where it's not always the most usable metric with this particular game. Warhammer appreciates clock speed to a great extent. We see the trade-off between cores and frequency when ricocheting between the 7700K and 6900K processors. The i7 7700K pulls ahead in every regard when pitted against the 6900K thanks to its 4.5 and 5.1 GHz clocks, and lands around 186 to 187 FPS average, and that's stock. As for the Ryzen R7 1800X, the new Zen Arc CPU lands between the 7350K stock and the 5.0 GHz overclocked variant. Total War shows a clear frequency focus, further emboldened by the 1800X's 5 FPS, or about 4% increase, from a 200 MHz overclock. Partly for this reason, among other architectural advantages, Intel again holds the lead even with processors of significantly lower cost. We still wouldn't recommend that you go out and buy an i3 7350K, not for $180 anyway, but the 1800X performs just slightly better than the overpriced but still cheaper i3 K-SKU CPU. Let's move that blackout bar. Total Warhammer now shows the biggest change in performance when disabling SMT. The AMD R7 1800X moves from 127 to 132 FPS average depending on the test and speed, to 153 FPS average with SMT off. Disabling AMD's most advertised property is increasing performance in the best case, or in the worst case, resulting in basically no performance difference. SMT seems to hamstring frame latency to some extent and creates enough overhead to burden us in Total Warhammer. Let's look at Watchdogs 2 next. At 1080p high, we're seeing the 6900K top charts around 119 FPS, where we're beginning to encounter a GPU bottleneck on the 1080 FTW. The low percentile performance sits at 94 FPS 1%, 77 FPS 0.1%. Comparatively, the half-price R7 1800X is operating around 84 FPS average with 1% lows hanging around 62 FPS and 50 FPS 0.1%. In terms of raw frame rate, that is a performance delta of approximately 35 FPS in averages between the two. Comparatively, the 7700K stock operates at around 113 FPS average, with the 6700K Skylake CPU around 110 average. Even the Devil's Canyon 4790K circa second quarter 2014 is outperforming the R7 1800X, placing at 100 FPS average. Disabling hyperthreading on the 7700K plants us about equal to the R7 1800X SMT enabled, so 8 cores, 16 threads, further demonstrating an architectural advantage for Intel right now in gaming workloads outside of the raw core and thread count of the AMD CPU. Overclocking the 1800X pushes to 87 FPS average with marginal improvements in the lows. The maximum sustainable overclock with our chip and motherboard seems to be about 3.9 GHz, resulting in an increase of 3.2% from stock. So we're at 3.7 GHz on all-core stock, or 3.9 with the OC. And ultimately, for Watchdogs 2, the 1800X performs mostly equally to an Intel i5 7600K CPU for $240. Disabling SMT reveals that performance is largely the same in Watchdogs 2, not as profound as in Total Warhammer, netting an output of 85 FPS average versus the original 84.3 FPS average, so SMT doesn't really help AMD here, but it's not hurting either. And by the way, Watchdogs 2 will utilize all the threads to some extent. It's not the only thing that matters in this case. Clock rate still matters, but this illustrates quite clearly that just having more cores doesn't win all arguments by default, and that's something we've experienced time and again with CPU architectures that venture into high core count territory. For time reasons, you can find Ashes of the Singularity, Metro Last Light, and GTA in the article in the description below if you want those benchmarks. We're going to move on to a little bit of 1440p now. When we presented some of our early findings to AMD, they suggested that we benchmark the CPU by creating a GPU bottleneck with 1440p resolution. Still, it's a little misleading to the overall capabilities of the CPUs. Such a benchmark means that future GPU upgrades could be bottlenecked by the CPU, which wouldn't be known if we were incorrectly testing the CPU by imposing GPU bottlenecks. Regardless, we ran a few anyway, despite only having 4 days to test the CPU. Here's a look at Watchdogs 2 at 1440p high. The AMD R7 1800X, even when taking AMD's suggestion of burdening the GPU, is still performing at a frame rate deficit to the cheaper 7700K. Now, of course, the next argument might be that the visible difference between 86 and 77 FPS average is not profound, and that'd be a fine argument. It unfortunately doesn't make sense to spend more money and get less. That's just bad value. Besides, when considering the CPU and platform tend to last the longest in a system, the upgrade pathways are going to be better on the platform, which has the highest baseline performance. Frame times suffer a bit with the 1800X falling to 48, 0.1% low, 60 FPS 1% low versus the 7700K at 68, 0.1% and 74, 1%. This isn't something where we're seeing stuttering. You'd have to fall a lot lower for that. So mark that very clearly, not stuttering. But it does indicate that AMD has other potential weaknesses that could emerge under the right conditions or later on. The next argument might be that mixed workload users like content creators would benefit from production advantages afforded by Ryzen. That's a much stronger argument, but still has caveats and counters. We'll point you back to the premier benchmarks for that discussion. Moving on to Battlefield 1 at 1440p, we're definitely developing a GPU bottleneck and beginning to invalidate the wants of 120 and 144 Hz users. The 1800X using the GPU as a crutch is now more or less on par with the 7700 and 6900K CPUs, and we're still seeing a decreased frame latency versus Intel, but just like with Watchdogs 2, that's not producing any noticeable stuttering to the end user. It's just measurable. In this particular title, benchmarking incorrectly does make the numbers look better for the 1800X, but the 7700K still outperforms it, is cheaper, and really we have to defer to the R7 1700 at $330 to see how AMD's future looks with gaming titles. We'll be testing that hopefully tomorrow. At this point, you might be feeling a little disillusioned when considering AMD's previous tech demos. Keep in mind that most of the charts leaked and the AMD official benchmarks shown were based on Cinebench or were gaming workloads that were inflated in one way or another by doing a few different things in benchmarking. In the Sniper Elite demo, AMD frequently looked at the skybox when reloading and often kept a larger percentage of the skybox in the frustum than the other side-by-side Intel processor. A skybox has no geometry, which is what loads the CPU with draw calls, and so it'll inflate the frame rate by nature of testing with a chaotically conducted methodology. As for the Battlefield 1 benchmarks that were demonstrated at the Sonoma event, AMD conducted these using other chaotic methods wherein AMD would zoom more frequently or at different intervals than the side-by-side Intel CPU, making it mostly impossible to actually compare the two head-to-head. So you're left with a number that basically says these are more or less equal. And most importantly of all, these demos were run at a 4K resolution. That creates a GPU bottleneck, meaning we're no longer observing true CPU performance. There's an argument to be made that low-end performance doesn't matter if you're stuck on the GPU, but that argument doesn't always hold. You don't buy a worse performing product for more money, especially when GPU upgrades in the future will eventually even out those limitations as bottlenecks external to the CPU vanish. As for Blender benchmarking, although AMD was looking at deltas and so it doesn't matter too much, AMD did demonstrate its Blender benchmarks using different settings to what we would recommend. In its Blender testing, AMD executes renders using just 150 samples per pixel, or what we consider to be preview quality, and runs unoptimized, well, somewhat, at 32 by 32 tile sizes. Not awful, but we'd recommend 16 by 16. They also render at 800 by 800 resolution. In our benchmark, we render using 400 samples per pixel for release candidate quality, 16 by 16 tiles, and a 4K resolution. This means that our benchmarks are not comparable to AMD's, but they are comparable against the other CPUs we've tested. As for Cinebench, AMD ran those tests with the 6900K platform using memory and dual channel rather than its full quad channel capabilities. That's not to say that these results would drastically change, but it's also not representative of how anyone would use an X99 platform. Cinebench isn't everything and neither is core count. As software developers move to support more threads, if they do, perhaps AMD would look better. For now, it is clearly not a good buy, the 1800X that is, in the gaming market. There is an argument to be made for the 1800X and its value in production workloads. Again, Premiere and Blender, it looks pretty good compared to the $1,000 Intel chip. It's half the price. It performs at least equally, if not slightly better, other than when you overclock Intel. So there it looks good, but again, you have to consider, are these workloads that are production focused something you can push to a much faster GPU, even if it's a 1070 or something like that? Because at that point, there's not a lot of reason to buy either the $1,000 or the AMD $500 chip. There are uses for the software acceleration, but if you're one of those people who needs that, you can hopefully figure out how the performance looks on your own. The R7 1700 may prove a better value for gaming. We'll have those benchmarks shortly. For now though, the 1800X is a disappointment and is not a processor we would recommend for gamers at its price point. Even mixed workload users should consider when and where software acceleration is better than GPU acceleration, if ever. But yes, overall, the 1800X is an impressive competitor to the 6900K, and it's significantly cheaper, so we'd recommend the 1800X over the 6900K if you're in one of those use case environments where it makes sense to have such a thing. For now, we're going to suggest waiting for the R7 1700 review if you're a gamer and hopefully buying in a lower end market, because that might have a better chance at competing with Intel, considering the giant price to performance disparity between the lower end chips and the higher end chips from both AMD and Intel. That's all for this one. Thank you for watching. As always, at patreon.com/gamersnexus if you would like to help us fund this type of in-depth analysis. Link in the description below for more information. Definitely subscribe for the 1700 and 1700X reviews and a Nintendo Switch teardown that we'll be posting shortly. I'll see you all next time.